So, welcome back to lecture series on animal physiology. So, we are into week 7. The first lecture of this week we have started with Alzheimer's. So, today we will talk about another aspect. So, we have devoted time on memory and learning and epilepsy and Alzheimer's. Today we will talk about movement related disorders. So, on one hand, in Alzheimer's disease, you lose your own self or you forget who you are. There is another disorder exactly of similar kind in terms of molecular or cellular pathology. That's called Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease is a disorder where a certain population of the neurons, a certain part of the brain which controls your movement starts to die off. We do not know why exactly. That's where the similarity between this disease and Alzheimer's lies. Why all of a sudden at that specific or a particular part or the loci of the brain certain neurons started to die off, we do not know, but it does happen. Now, once it starts to die off, these neurons at that particular location has their projections in the spinal cord which governs your movement. So, that leads to because since those neurons which are sitting in the spinal cord do not get the signal coordination, that leads to a movement disorder, or you really cannot control the movement of your hands or legs or in a series of issues. So, let's try to see how really the circuit works and where the drawback is. Okay. If you remember, when we talk about ventral and dorsal pathway, so this is your brain, okay, and this is the spinal cord, this is out here is the ventral horn, like here, and there is a spot. So, this is, of course, we have talked about the hippocampal regions, and you have say motor cortex somewhere here, motor cortex. Okay. So, just before I forget, so this is, we are into week 7, lecture 2, W7L2. Okay. So, here is the motor cortex. So, the way your movement thing occurs is this. So, there is information, some kind of information which goes, say for example, you have to pick up a glass or something, the information travels all the way to the motor cortex like this. So, this is the info, and along the ascending pathway, which is also called dorsal pathway, the information, the electrical impulse goes to the motor cortex. At the motor cortex, there is a certain degree of processing of that information takes place. Specific zone, in this case, when we talk about Parkinson's disorder, Parkinson's disease, at this point there are certain degree of processing which takes place, and from here there are certain neurons which has projections like this on the ventral horn. Okay. So, for example, on the ventral horn neuron there are projections like this. Now, at the ventral horn neuron, let me blow up the ventral horn now. So here is that process of the neuron which is coming. This is what we meant by projections. At that spot, there is a bigger motor neuron which is sitting, which will take the info back for your action, right? And this is that projection which is coming from here. So, this neuron which is bringing the information from the motor cortex to the motor neuron which is sitting out in the ventral horn, which is your, so this is ascending pathway or the dorsal horn, and this is the central A is your ventral pathway or descending pathway. Why you call it descending? Because it is coming down from the brain, descending pathway, or you can call it also motor pathway. Okay. And by the same token, they are all same, and by the same token you can call the dorsal pathway as sensory pathway. Okay. So, now as the information is coming down out here, so at this location there is a synaptic contact where the signal which has been coming from the motor cortex all the way to the ventral horn out here, the message is passed. Message is transmitted. Now, suppose from the motor cortex no message arises here. So, automatically this motor neuron which is sitting at the ventral horn will not be able to execute anything. Now, such thing could only happen when the motor neuron from, so these both are motor neuron, one motor neuron projection comes from the motor cortex to the ventral horn. So, there are names. So, the motor neuron which is coming from the motor cortex is called upper motor neuron, and the second one is called the lower motor neuron or somatic motor neuron, because it is in contact with the specific cell type or whatever, right, where it has to execute its action. So, the only situation where the upper motor neuron fails to deliver message to the motor neuron could be either for some way or other they become silent, or this neuron which is coming as a projection started to degenerate. So, there is no signal which is happening from here. Such situation arises in the case of Parkinson, where these upper motor neurons, which are located in this location which is called substantia nigra, started to die off. And exactly the same way as we have observed in the case of Alzheimer's, these neurons started to degenerate. And once they degenerate, and these neurons are dopaminergic neuron. When we talk about dopaminergic, means these neurons secrete dopamine as a neurotransmitter. I'm just putting NTs. Okay. So these dopaminergic neuron at the substantia nigra started to die off, and they do not signal the lower motor neuron. So the circuit, which was essentially something like this, going all the way up, it is perfectly fine. But now from here, signal, no more signal arrives. But this part of the circuit is all okay. But if you do not receive a signal out here, there is no signal. That means there is a issue, and that's precisely what happens in the case of Parkinson disease. There is something called L-DOPA therapy, for which there is a Nobel Prize which has gone. I'll leave it up to you to see that what it is. L-DOPA is an analog of dopamine, which is being implanted, slow releasing, which kind of feed these neurons. Somewhere or other you have to really have a slow releasing stuff which is there. You can read through it. I'll leave it up to your wisdom to read through this L-DOPA therapy, and you'll like it. There are some very interesting aspect about the L-DOPA therapy. But what is important is, in both the cases, whether it is Alzheimer's, whether it is Parkinson, the progress of the disease is same. If you remember what I was drawing in the last class, so this is the pyramidal hippocampal neuron. Now, if you replace this pyramidal hippocampal neuron with a dopaminergic neuron, just you change the name, and of course definitely that will lead to the change in the shape. It is not as pyramidal as this one. But if you look at what is happening at this zone and this zone, for both of them it is a similar trail. So apparently there is same type of neurodegeneration. And this neural degeneration is very unpredictable, and why it happens at a particular age, and what is the genesis. Is it genetics, or is it physiology, or is it both, or is it environment? We really do not know. Exactly, we are on the same page as Alzheimer's about how this degeneration gets initiated and leads to a compromised living, compromising the quality of life forever. If you think over it, that unless we have a way to repair, so you have injuries in your hands, legs, or wherever, you have a modus operandi to kind of get around it. But in these situations, you hardly can do anything. You are fairly helpless. So for Alzheimer's, we really have do not have anything. In the case of Parkinson's, at least we have some degree of recovery. I won't say recovery, some degree of restoration of function in the form of L-DOPA therapy. That's all we have. So, these are conditions, or these are situations which happens in the brain where you have very limited access in terms of the drug entry, or in terms of course surgery is a big challenge, or even in terms of regenerative medicine where you think of even implanting stem cells. Why the access is tough? First of all, it's because of the blood-brain barrier. If you look at the structure, it is always surrounded by another lining, and these vessels are never in direct contact with the neurons. There is always a layer. So it's something like, if you have the neurons out here, if this is the neuronal terminal, so there will be always a kind of a very thin film, which I am showing in yellow, which will be filled cavity, what we call as CSF, or cerebrospinal fluid, which is covering the blood brain barrier. Okay, and the blood vessels will be all traveling like this, but they will never be in direct contact. So now we realize that for a drug to jump, suppose you introduce a drug, these blue dots are the drugs, and for a drug to jump to this side, it has to cross through the blood-brain barrier, and blood-brain barrier is not so easy to cross unless you have specific boats, molecular boats, or the cargo boats which can carry this small drug molecule in a boat like this, or ferry this molecule in a boat to the site where the neuron is present. So it has to cross through this channel out here. Unless it crosses through this channel, it won't be able to, interact with the neurons on the other side. So the biggest challenge of any kind of neurodegenerative problems, or any removing or brain tumor, or any kind of problem in the brain, is how easily you can do the surgery. The answer is very challenging, because this whole thing is enclosed in a strong structure, which is your skull, and this whole spinal cord is, and what once we'll talk about the spinal cord injury in the very next section, you will realize the challenge. So there are these columns through which this whole thing passes. So, and these are bony columns. It is not a easy access for these kind of surgeries to be conducted easily. And in terms of the drug therapy, the problem is the same, because this drug molecule has to diffuse through this space, and this space, the blood-brain barrier fluid, unless otherwise you have a carrier molecule. Say for example, brain uses glucose as its major source of energy. Now there are glucose transporters which are sitting out here. There are these glucose transporter molecules. Okay, these glucose transporters help in ferrying the glucose from blood to neuron or to brain. Okay. So, if you replace glucose by say a drug molecule here, by a drug molecule. Now, unless there is a ferry for that drug molecule to reach to the other side, that will remain stuck on this side. So, even if you take a drug, there is no way, there is no guarantee that that drug is going to reach to your brain or to the specific part of the brain. Your other option is that you inject something through this skull at that specific spot by drilling through the skull, which is not so easy. And then too, the very moment you do anything of that sort, it means you are now exposing your brain to something which you do not want it to do so easily, unless otherwise. Or you surgically cut open the skull, access the brain, and that's what they do most of the time in the case of brain tumors, where the glial cells kind of outnumbers at a specific spot, and those glial growth has to be removed. So, in summary, accessing brain is a very, very challenging task, and understanding the uncertainty of this disease to approach is another very challenging scenario. So, with these two cases where one's individuality is being compromised in the form of Alzheimer's, in the other case Parkinson, where your movement is being compromised, I will close it on this lecture. So, in the next lecture we will pretty much take over from here if the damage happens in the lower motor neuron, which will bring us to the situation of two more diseases. One is spinal cord injury and the relevant disease, what could happen, and the second one is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, followed by we will talk about multiple sclerosis, which is a problem of the glial cell, and in that process we will talk about myelination and myelination related disorders. Thank you for your patience listening.